Okay, thank you, Herman, for your introduction. Herman thinks that I am a man who likes challenges. So he asked me to read a text and to do it after Monica's performance. That's impossible. Yeah. That is mission impossible, I believe, isn't it? Yeah. But let's give it a try. I understand Mr. Brian Taves, or Brian, who do you call him in this country? Taves? It's a Mexican. He is a film historian linked with the University of South California, I understand. And this is a paper, I noticed 14 pages, 10 minutes each page. Well, no problem for you, I think. All right. Talbot Mundy was born in London in 1879 and raised according to constraining Victorian standards. However, he was a free thinker and non-conformist from childhood on and ran away from home at age 16. 2 years later, he was in India, where he aided famine relief and rode on horseback along the country's northern frontiers. He spent 4 years in East Africa, alternating jobs for the government with such outlaw trades as poaching, arriving in the United States in 1909. 2 years later, he was selling stories and articles to magazines. Mundy's second book, King of the Khyber Rifles, he wrote in 1917, told of a fabulous character, Jasmini, who tried to conquer India, and it quickly became a classic for its combination of fantastic elements with adventure. It won Mundy a reputation as the successor to H. Rider Haggard and Rudyard Kipling. In comparison, he found himself odious since Mundy opposed Kipling's jingoistic attitude towards colonialism. Native figures, especially Indians, often dominated Mundy's novels, placed in a position of imparting Eastern wisdom to Western characters. Equally apparent, even in his early writings, was Mundy's feminism. A believer in full equality between the sexes, his female characterizations were vivid and proactive. Mundy's last great adventure came with a trip to Jerusalem in 1920. There's a lot of air miles, I think. The guy collected, yeah. Seeing the tumult of the time up close, and he wrote a series of novels about contemporary Arabia that advocated independence from the region, for the region. He settled in San Diego, California, where he joined the Theosophical Society, Point Loma. H.P. Blavatsky's rendering of Eastern teachings, combined with Mundy's own experiences as a fantasy increasingly dominating his fiction. While residing at the Society, Mundy wrote the novels Om, the Secret of Ahbor Valley in 1924 and The Devil's Guard in 1926 about the teachings of the Master in India and Tibet, especially karma and reincarnation. The theosophical influence was also evident as Mundy tried a new genre, historical novels, producing the classic series Troves of Samutras in 1925 and 26, Queen Cleopatra in 1929, and Purple Pirate in 1935, books that raised a furor at the time for their critical interpretation of Rome and Julius Caesar. Talbot Mundy died suddenly in 1940, but his writing has continuously found new readers among succeeding generations, with over 50 reprints of his novels in the years since his death. Talbot Mundy was a name, by the way, chosen, typically, especially for adventurers of the period who were not especially pleased with their actual identity or wanted to add an aura of mystery in their name to their name, he adopted a new name, not a pseudonym. Walter Gold was his only known pseudonym. He and his parents were incompatible even before he first ran away from home. They were traditional bourgeois high church Tories who supported British imperialism. On every one of those counts, young William Lancaster Gribben was opposed to their beliefs and grew more so with age. For instance, see his views on the Middle East. He and his brother were active on opposite sides of Zionism versus Arab self-determination issues. While there was some reconciliation in later years of and on correspondence with his brother, Mundy never stayed under the same roof of either his brother or sister. By contrast, during a difficult time in the 1930s, Talbot and his wife were taken in as summer guests by his cousins, the Mundys, from whom he had taken the name as a youth. They had become acquainted during his colonial years before coming to America. The Mundys were fascinated by Oriental traditions and intrigued by Theosophy, just the opposite of his own childhood. It was no accident that young Gribben chose the name Mundy. Today, his brother's family still considers him notorious for failing to live up to Gribben and Rule Britannia expectations. The Mundys, by contrast, while English also, honored their cousin as a writer, believing Ohm a classic, recognizing the philosophical teachings as well as the spellbinding narrative that continues to draw readers over half a century after Talbot Mundy's death. So often, back then, a person's family beginnings and ancestry determined the person they could become. For an individual, especially an adventurer in Mundy's time, a transformation was typical. It allowed a fundamental change in identity to begin life anew, to sever ties with the past, to that's very difficult to read. That leaves mistakes behind, I think it's mentioned. You know where the pictures come, yeah? Erwin? Because yes? Okay, thank you. Because I don't. William Lancaster Gribben became Talbot Mundy no less than T.H. Lawrence sought to evade publicity by taking the name Shaw. William Lancaster Gribben found that his ability to begin anew as Talbot Mundy was part of his own belief in death and rebirth, the reincarnation of the soul. For his own new identity allowed him to come to America and become the writer whose fame has so long endured. At the beginning of the 1920s, when literary representations of the Far East were more often epitomized by the menace of the Fu Manchu than the grace of Shangri-La, the Theosophical Society played a vital role in bringing about a change in those conventions. They provided an intellectual base for an alteration towards recognizing the Orient as a source of wisdom rather than merely a colorful background. Theosophy's link to this tradition of popular literature was through Talbot Mundy, an adventurer and writer who was attracted to Point Loma and Catherine Tingley's teaching. He joined the society in 1923 and for the next 5 years wrote and lived on or adjacent to the community of which he was a member. During the previous 10 years, Mundy had gained an enviable reputation as one of the most popular, prolific and original authors of contemporary adventure tales in the Far East. Not only was this one of the most widely read genres of the time, but Mundy had a personal following that enabled him to sell virtually anything he wrote with minimal editorial interference. While sharing certain similarities in background and literary style with Rudyard Kipling, Sax Rohmer and H. Rider Haggard, spiritually and structurally, Mundy was more akin to Joseph Conrad. From the beginning, Mundy was a seeker, a man who ran away at age 16 rather than conform to the expectations of a high church family. During years of wandering through India, Africa, and elsewhere, he acquired an interest and sympathy for such ideas as karma and reincarnation, observing native magic and occult teachings firsthand. This early proclivity made him an almost instant convert when he happened to encounter Theosophy on a trip to the Western United States in the late fall of 1922. The magic of Blavatsky's pen, he said, stirred in me something deeper and more challenging than I had known was there. He was inspired by the teachings of Catherine Tingley and Gottfried de Purucker and study of the secret doctrine and especially Isis Unveiled to write a long series of articles for the Theosophical path. Simultaneously, he continued to turn out the fiction that was his source of income. This encounter with Theosophy added a new depth to Mundy's fiction, providing a door to a broader, more intellectual dimension than was evident in his earlier books. Whereas previously he had explored the physical and material mysteries of India and the Far East, his writing would now expand to encompass its metaphysical and spiritual realms. During the ensuing years, his novels pioneered a new direction in the genre by infusing a strong philosophical bent, one clearly in sympathy with the teachings of Eastern religion and by extension the concepts propounded by the Theosophical Society. During the 1920s, Mundy came of age as a writer, with the decade seeing his greatest fiction both in terms of quantity and quality. However, it was not the Theosophical Society alone which was responsible for this seriousness of purpose. Mystical themes had appeared sporadically in his books of the previous years, with King of the Khyber Rifles, his most famous to date. The type of stories for which Mundy became best known as Point Loma had, in fact, already begun to be written before he ever knew anything about Theosophy. For instance, in mid-1922 he wrote Caves of Terror, the first novel to fully reveal his incorporation of fantasy to facilitate the presentation of Oriental philosophy. The story told of an Englishman investigating the supernatural in India, encountering a wise Mahatma who reveals secrets of the Indian religious philosophy, both its possibilities and pitfalls. Surprisingly, this earnest exploration of Eastern religion was a favorite of readers at the time. Theosophy's influence was greatest upon Mundy's Om, The Secret of Ahbor Valley, written at the end of 1923 after almost a year in contact with the organization. Om was his most literary work to date, one that exhibited a maturing skill with plot structure, theme and depth of character, using the prototype of the wise old sage who had appeared in Caves of Terror. Om concerned a lama and his caravan who traveled toward Tibet, performing small plays wherever they go to teach philosophical lessons in the form of parables. Not only was this a reflexive analogy on Mundy's part for the role of his own tales and parables, but it was the most successful form he devised to convey abstract ideas in a comprehensible, practical manner. More effectively than in any of his other works, Mundy struck a delicate, unique balance between the descriptive, the narrative, and the didactic, while still retaining the guise of the storyteller. The nature of the philosophy in Ohm was remarkable. Mundy used the generic universe of Indian adventure as a vehicle to advance a personal assimilation of Eastern teachings, as understood through theosophy, but also by his own experience and study of the Orient. This background gave him a talent for making the fantastic seem plausible, so that in his stories, East and West synthesized without clash or disharmony. In this way, Ohm revitalized a cycle in fantasy adventure literature, crystallizing the archetype of the Westerner who quits the dissatisfying life of colonial service to disguise himself as a native and search for the wisdom of the East. Other writers had used this structure previously, but with a crucial difference. Mundy had a profound and abiding respect for Eastern thought, enriched by what was clearly both a scholarly and a first-hand knowledge of the religions whereof he wrote. For instance, in comparison with Kipling's Kim is revealing, Mundy, unlike his predecessor, thrust Indians, along with their religious and cultural traditions, into the foreground, consciously denying Western assumptions of superiority. These qualities have continued to distinguish Mundy from his many imitators and successors in the genre. Expecting Ohm to be heavily criticized for its favorable portrayal of Eastern ideas, Mundy was surprised to see it become a bestseller. Within months, it was also placed on the book list of standard theosophical literature, alongside the description profound truths in the guise of vivid and fascinating fiction. Theosophists readily took the book to heart as a perfect expression of their beliefs in the form of a novel. Mundy's next story of India, written in 1926, was entitled The Devil's Guard, and embodied an attempt to repeat the combination of philosophy and adventure in a context much less literary and meditative. Instead, he sought to convey Eastern concepts through the depiction of a dreamlike realm of nightmarish quest where souls are governed by psychic forces. The Devil's Guard was actually part of a tetralogy, so that must be 3, and that had begun with Caves of Terror, continuing with The Nine Unknown in 1923, and finally ending in 1930 with Jim Grim. In these 4 novels, Mundy asserts his strong belief in reincarnation, building on the theosophical and oriental beliefs in the masters, highly evolved adepts who had acquired a knowledge of the wisdom which must accordingly be entrusted only incrementally to selected individuals, lest it be abused. When asked about the masters, Mundy replied that he believed that he had once met such an individual who, however, naturally would not admit to that identity. Catherine Tingley also maintained that she had encountered one of these beings. In another, completely different type of story, Mundy again reconciled the popular appeal of an adventure story with teachings of a theosophical variety. This was in a series of massive historical novels dealing with the ancient world, begun in 1925, entitled Trows of Samothrace, Caesar's Dies, Queen Cleopatra, Purple Pirate, and Roman Holiday. The saga was first conceived as an original interpretation of Cleopatra, in opposition to the portraits of her by Shakespeare and Shaw. Mundy was intrigued by the political and social forces surrounding a woman who, like Catherine Tingley, was in a position of leadership, but the stories grew to encompass an even broader realm, portraying in terms of Theosophy's belief in the tides and cycles of the history, the period as one in which a tired world turned away from spiritual values. These contending forces were etched into the conflict between Cleopatra and Rome, as personified by Julius Caesar, with the later representing militarism and the attempt of a few to impose their will on the many. Although these interpretations may not seem to so remarkable today, Mundy's anti-classical views evoked a storm of protest when the first of his Roman novels appeared. Recall that he was writing 8 years before Robert Graves' series on the Emperor Claudius. Not until the 1930s would Mundy's pioneering efforts toward revising popular conceptions of the ancient world receive widespread praise. Mundy's historical novels reflected theosophical thinking in other ways as well. In Throes of Samothrace, he suggested that the Samothracians and the Druids had their foundation in the same source, in line with the theosophical belief in one very ancient, essential mother philosophy from which all others are derived. However, this has had the unfortunate side effect of causing some critics to misread these stories as fantasy rather than historical fiction. After this concentrated writing of theosophical novels, Caves of Terror, The Nine Unknown, Ohm, Throes of Samothrace, The Devil's Guard, Caesar Dies, and Queen Cleopatra, during the mid-1920s, a series of factors caused Mundy to fade very rapidly from the scene of Point Loma. The most immediate cause of his leaving San Diego in 1928 was a series of business difficulties that befell him. By nature, Mundy seldom spent long in one place before leaving to partake of new experiences. As his widow, Dawn Mundy, told me, I think he sort of went through things and then looked for something else. Okay. Shortly after Gottfried de Purucker's succession to Tingley's post, Mundy's last article in the Theosophical Path appeared, and his books Ohm and Queen Cleopatra were eliminated from the standard reading list of Theosophical literature. He and Purucker did not share the close fellowship that had preserved Mundy's esteem for Tingley. While retaining a lifelong sympathy for Theosophy, and despite the continued affection members had for him and his works, Mundy gradually drifted away from its influence, both personally and in terms of the theosophical impact of his fiction. Mundy was clearly more than a mere writer of diverting adventure tales. Through his literature, he was engaged in a lifelong discourse on philosophy and religion. He wrote stories that could be simultaneously read on two levels. As he said of Ohm, it is soaked with sound philosophy and stirring mystery plus dangerous adventure. Unlike such otherwise similar writers as Rudyard Kipling and H. Rider Haggard, Mundy utilized exotic locals for the treatment of metaphysical subjects in the context of Eastern thinking as well as adventure. With his own personal experience in the far-flung corners of the world and the aid of the theosophical influence, Mundy was able to effectively translate Oriental ideas into a Western idiom. Yet this avoidance of the simple escapism is one of the factors that has allowed him to remain overshadowed. At the same time, his foundation as an author whose writings clearly belong to the fantasy adventure genres rendered him suspect to conventional literary critics. Nonetheless, his popularity was deep and has proved lasting, with 16 of his novels having been republished on 39 occasions in the 45 years since his death. In retrospect, the time Mundy became involved with Theosophy was fortuitous, allowing the movement through him to have an enormous impact on the genre of Oriental fantasy. Under the leadership of Catherine Tingley, the Theosophical Society utilized popular appeals to spread their views, for instance in the plays presented in the Greek theatre. Already the Society had in Kenneth Morris, one historian and novelist who had won Theosophical praise and modest outside acclaim. And in previous years, Blavatsky had provided a recognized influence on such figures as George Russell and W.B. Yeats. But in Mundy, the Society found an author who could reach out to as wide an audience as possible through both mass readership and literary types of books. Fortunately, Mundy had arrived at Point Loma at the height of its glory in the Tingley era. After her passing, Purucker moved the organization in a more esoteric direction, which placed a lower priority on Mundy's contribution. With Mundy's departure from Point Loma, the Theosophical Society lost its best opportunity to disperse its concepts to a wide public, with any hope of ready acceptance. Within his novels, the Eastern notions that were the basis of Theosophical beliefs had the best chance to be favorably received without the rejection that would likely result from an unconcealed presentation to a largely Judeo-Christian audience. Mundy proved that it was possible to palatably integrate the philosophy of a minority, avant-garde group into popular works of fiction and still retain a wide readership. He won the enthusiasm of theosophists as well as the public at large, and was unique for achieving both these goals, the philosophy melding persuasively, that's a difficult word, into his fiction. Yet, while promoting many of Theosophy's specific ideas, Mundy's tales were never mere propaganda, since he expressed Oriental concepts through the filter of his own experience and Occidental consciousness, without regard to any specific theosophical doctrine. This was the secret of his wide popularity and durability, the reason he was heralded not only by theosophists, but acquired a personal following that has persisted and regenerated to this day, spreading theosophical notions in a subtle and often unrealized way to hundreds of thousands of readers. Perhaps more than ever before, Talbot Mundy is not one but two authors. Allow me to explain what may seem a conundrum. During his life, Mundy wrote for a living and had to keep the needs of the marketplace in mind, especially writing for magazines and later radio as his primary source of income. Only a relatively small portion of his output was published in book form, and that accounted for a fraction of Mundy's income by comparison with the monies received from magazine publications. These were the mainstream readers. There can be no doubt that had Mundy written simply adventure or fantasy stories, he would have been more popular in his time. He knew how to write first-rate entertainment. but he would also have been less durable. What has given him literally stature and a measure of immortality is his dedication to theosophy and Eastern teachings. While for theosophists and those sympathetic to these teachings, this is the attraction for Mundy, it also undoubtedly diminished his audience. Many simply wanted a rousing tale, not Eastern wisdom, and particularly in the first half of the 20th century, in a time of overt colonialism, there was even more resistance to stories of the teachings of India and Tibet. That same dichotomy exists today. Look up Talbot Mundy on Amazon and you'll see endless reprints of his books published in 1922 and earlier that everyone knows are in the public domain. Some of these are quite good, such as King of the Khyber Rifles and Guns of the Gods, and are evocative of his best later writing. Others, like the regimental short story The Soul of a Regiment, endlessly anthologized and frankly embarrassing today. They reflect that the young Mundy was asked to write stories of the British Army, memorializing his homeland, the homeland he had fled to become an American citizen, because the tenor of English values was contrary to the man who had awakened to the teachings of India he had encountered. Fortunately, there do exist a number of us keeping alive Talbot Mundy's best stories. After my 2005 Mundy biography, I edited an anthology, Winds from the East, where you can find a variety of stories and novelists, combined with articles and poetry that testify to his belief in the East. Some of the pieces in Winds from the East were reprinted from the Theosophical part. I was pleased to work with the publisher of Winds from the East to bring out several other Mundy books that had long been out of print. Two of these, Black Light and Old Ugly Face, were the first complete American editions. Previously, they had been censored in this country and only published in complete form in England. Another book, The Red Flame of Erinpura, a story of the masters written when Mundy lived at Point Loma in the 1920s, had never been published in the United States outside of magazine form. Also in this series is the political satire, the Ganga Sahib, and two critical editions for which I have written extended introductions, The Thunder Dragon Gate and Mundy's philosophical treatise I Say Sunrise. Other publishers have now reprinted such books as the mystical stories The Grey Mahatma, aka Caves of Terrors, and The Nine Unknown, and the novels of the Roman Empire, Troves of Samothrace, Queen Cleopatra, and Caesar Dies. All based on theosophical ideas. All of these I've mentioned are readily available on Amazon.com. But omissions remain. The classic of Tibet written at Point Loma, The Devil's Guard, is out of print. And there are others almost as precious, long available. Full Moon, Mundy's novel of the fourth dimension. Purple Pirate, the last book of the Trow saga. The mystical Secret Service novel CID, or the science fiction account of The Roof of the World, Jim Grimm. And there's more I have not mentioned, including some fascinating work that only appeared in magazine form and deserved book publication. By pinpointing these titles, I am hoping to encourage others to take up the lead of my own Winds from the East and the Ariel Press series. Speaking for myself, my interest is in spreading the good word about an author whose teaching has been valuable in my own life. No profit in this for me. Sadly, that may be one problem for Mundy. There's no real economic gain to republishing his work outside of the role small presses can play, which have a dedication to theosophy and kindred thinking. The agency that has represented Mundy since 1931 simply has no interest in him, either promoting or licensing. They barely respond even when movie producers come knocking. The agency's appraisal of Mundy's literature value is so neglectable that they actually once told Wright to add erotic passages to King of the Khyber Rifles. Or they sold rights to it. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, there are really two Mundys. The adventurer enthusiasts, the pulp magazine collectors, are reissuing early Mundy stories that are high on thrills but low in content. Some of these have some interest, but many, I suspect, Mundy himself would wish had been forgotten. I know his letters expressed disdain for many of these novice stories. That leaves much work to be done by those who are here at this conference, who are theosophically inclined and represent small presses. Some Mundy enthusiasts have done fabulous illustrative interpretations of his work in recent years, and our colleagues overseas are doing their part, and translation of the epic novel Throes of Samothrace, nearly 1,000 pages, appeared in Spain last year. I stand ready to assist. The Mundy bibliography is in my biography and in Winds from the East, and I'll gladly make suggestions. And certainly many of you may have favorites. The Devil's Guard, Full Moon, and more are all calling us, stories that deserve to be shared with new generations. Thank you very much.
One quick. How many people here have read Om? Very good. Just one little anecdote. Om was at a Tibetan Buddhist gathering. I think it was a Dalai Lama teaching. I was able to hand Richard Gere a copy of Om, which he read, which he liked very much, and he gave to a movie producer friend, who then did get rights from, as far as I know, from the difficult company who owns the rights. But that's quite a long time ago now, and nothing has happened, but there is a potential there.